Hello, time for chapter 13. It's called The Late Mr. Bartholomew. Here you go. Still hear the bird in the wind in the tree, and every now and again Mr. Howard smashes something, so just ignore it. In the Kitsons' flat, time was not allowed to dodge about in the unreliable, confusing way it did in the garden. Forward to a tree's felling, and then back to before the fall, and then still farther back again to a little girl's first arrival, then forward again. No, in the flat time was marching steadily onwards in the way it is supposed to go, from minute to minute, from hour to hour, from day to day. The day for Tom's going home had already come and gone, but he was still staying with his aunt and uncle. He had managed that for himself the very day before he was due to go. He had nerved himself, cleared his throat, and said, "I wish I hadn't to go home tomorrow." Uncle Alan had been reading the newspaper, the sheets crumpled down onto his knees, as though his hands no longer had the strength to hold them. His eyes refocused from the print onto Tom. "What?" "I wish I hadn't to go home tomorrow," said Tom. He dared not go further, but he spoke loudly. Aunt Gwen gave a cry of amazement and delight, and actually clapped her hands. "Would you like to stay?" "Yes." "Several days more?" "Another week?" "Or more," said Tom. "We'll send a telegram at once," said Aunt Gwen, and ran out. Tom and his uncle were left together. Alan Kitson studied Tom with intense curiosity. "Why do you want to stay here?" "I won't if you'd rather not," said Tom with pride, but his heart sank at the thought. No, Uncle Alan still watched him, but I wondered why. "What is there to interest a boy here? To pass his time, even?" "I just like it here," Tom muttered. Aunt Gwen came back from sending her telegram to Tom's parents. Her face was flushed. She spoke fast and eagerly. "We'll go about and see the sights and go excursions. We'll do so much now you're out of quarantine and staying on. You needn't be so cooped up dully indoors any more, Tom." Tom said thank you, but without enthusiasm. He would have much preferred to be left to dullness indoors as he used to be. He lived his real and interesting life at night time, when he went out into the garden. In the daytime he wanted only peace, to think back and to think forwards, always to the garden, to write of the garden to Peter. He did not want to sleep, but all the same the daytime in the flat was like a period of sleep to him. He needed its rest. Aunt Gwen arranged several expeditions to the shops and to the museum in Castleford and the cinema. Tom bore them patiently. He liked the cinema best because he was in the dark, and so he could sit with his eyes shut and think his own thoughts. Towards the end of Tom's lengthened stay, the weather changed for the worst. Still Aunt Gwen obstinately insisted on treats and trips, now with waterproofs and umbrella. After a visit to the cinema, she and Tom had been obliged to wait for some time for the bus, and Tom had stood in a puddle. It was his aunt who noticed his position, and that only as the bus came. "Tom, you've been standing in a puddle all this time, quite a deep puddle." He was surprised. His head had been in the clouds, in the white clouds that pile above an eternally summer day, and he had not been noticing his feet at all. Now that he thought of them, they certainly felt very damp and cold. "I hope you don't catch cold," his aunt said anxiously. In answer to this, Tom sneezed. His aunt rushed him home to a hot drink and a hot bath and bed. But a cold, once it had its fingers on its victim, will seldom loosen its grip before the due time. So Tom had a severe cold that kept him in bed for several days, and indoors for many more. His convalescence was not hurried. Gwen Kitson wrote happily to her sister that Tom would not be fit to travel for some time yet. And Tom wrote to Peter, "It's a wonderful piece of luck, the next best thing to measles." Every night he was able to steal downstairs as usual into the garden, and there the feverishness of his chill always left him, as though the very greenness of trees and plants and grass cooled his blood. He played with Hattie. In the daytime he lay back among his pillows, deliberately languid. Uncle Alan, who was touched by the idea of the sick child, offered to teach him chess, but Tom said he did not feel clear-headed enough. He did not want to talk, and he allowed his aunt to see that he was certainly not up to being read to from schoolgirl adventures. At the beginning of Tom's illness, his head had really felt a little light, and his eyelids gummed themselves up easily. He did not mind keeping them closed. Then in his imagination he could look into his garden and see, in fancy, what Hattie might be doing there. His aunt would tiptoe into his bedroom and look at him doubtfully. She would test whether he were awake by a whispering of his name. The voice recalled him without his understanding at once to what. His eyelids opened onto his own bedroom, but his eyes printed off the shadowy figure of Hattie against the barred window and the cupboard, and between himself and the figure of his aunt at the foot of the bed. Hattie's image haunted the room for Tom at this time, and so it was perhaps that he began at first idly, then to consider seriously whether she herself were not in some unusual way a ghost. There was no one who knew her ghost story and could tell it to Tom, so he began to try and make it up for himself. Hattie had lived here long, long ago, in this very house, with a garden he knew of. Here she had lived, here died. From below sounded the striking of Mrs. Bartholomew's grandfather clock, that knew secrets but would not tell them. Listening, Tom suddenly caught his breath. Mrs. Bartholomew, of course! She, of all people, might know something of the past history of this house, or rather, that there must once have been a Mr. Bartholomew. Ooh, it's an enormous bumblebee just gone out past the window. Hope it doesn't come in. Anyway, there must once have been a Mr. Bartholomew, and his family had perhaps owned this house for generations, and therefore he had known all about it. He would surely have told his wife the history of it, which she would still remember. Tom resolved that as soon as he was better he would call on Mrs. Bartholomew. True, she was an unsociable old woman of whom people were afraid, but Tom could not let that stand in his way. He would boldly ring her front door bell. She would open her front door just a crack and peer crossly out at him. Then she would see him, and at the sight of his face her heart would melt. Tom had read of such occurrences in the more old-fashioned children's books. He had never before thought them very probable, but now it suited him to believe. Mrs. Bartholomew, who did not like children, would love Tom as soon as she saw his face. She would draw him inside at once, then and there, and later, over a tea-table laden with delicacies for him alone, she would tell Tom the stories of long ago. Sometimes Tom would ask questions, and she would answer them. A little girl called Harriet or Hattie, she would say musingly. Why, yes, my late husband told me once of such a child. Oh, long ago. An only child she was, and an orphan. When her parents died, her aunt took her into this house to live. Her aunt was a disagreeable woman. So the story in Tom's imagination rolled on. It became confused and halting where Tom himself did not already know the facts, but after all he would only have to wait to pay his call upon Mrs. Bartholomew to hear it all from her own lips. She would perhaps end her story, he thought, with the dropping of her voice. And since then, Tom, they say that she and her garden and all the rest haunt this house. They say that those who are lucky may go down about when the clock strikes for midnight, and open what was once the garden door, and see the ghost of that garden and of the little girl. Tom's mind ran on the subject. His cold was getting so much better now that his aunt and uncle had insisted on coming to sit with him to keep him company. One day, hardly speaking aloud, Tom began a sentence. When Mr. Bartholomew lived in this house... But I don't think Mr. Bartholomew ever did live here, said Aunt Gwen. Do you, Alan? Uncle Alan did not answer at first, being in the depths of a chess problem which he had failed to interest Tom. But Aunt Gwen, Tom protested, this was his family home. How else would he have known the story of this house, and the ghost histories too? How else could he have told Mrs. Bartholomew? Why, Tom, said his aunt in bewilderment, Mr. Bartholomew, whoever he was, never lived in this house, Uncle Alan now said positively. Mrs. Bartholomew was a widow when she came here, and that wasn't so many years ago either. But what about the clock? "What clock?" "The grandfather clock in the hall. You said it belonged to Mrs. Bartholomew, but the clock has always been in this house. It was here long, long ago. It was here when the house had a garden. Now, what reason have you for supposing all this, Tom?" asked Uncle Allen. He spoke less sharply than usual because he really thought that the boy must be feverish. Tom was searching in his mind for an explanation that yet would not give away his secret, when his aunt came unexpectedly to his rescue. "You know, Alan, the clock certainly must have been here a long time, because its screws at the back have rusted into the wall." "Well now, Tom, that might explain it a little," said Uncle Allen. He patted Tom's hand as it lay on the counterpane to soothe him. "The clock may well have been here a long time, as you say, and during that time the screws rusted up. After that happened, the clock wouldn't be moved without danger of damaging it. When old Mrs. Bartholomew came, she had to buy the clock with the house. You see, Tom, it's all quite straightforward if you reason it out." From that time abruptly Tom ceased to hope for anything from Mrs. Bartholomew. The possibility of Hattie's being a ghost stayed in his mind, however, at the back of his mind. He was not even aware of the presence of the idea until one day in the garden it became the cause of a quarrel with Hattie herself. It was the only real quarrel that ever took place between them. They were beginning to build their tree house in the steps of St. Paul's. As usual, Tom was directing, while Hattie did the work of pulling and plaiting branches together to make the walls. The floor, of old pieces of boarding that Hattie had found in the potting shed, was already in place. Hattie, as she worked, was singing to herself from hymns and songs and ballads. Now she was singing the end of the ballad of Sweet Molly Malone. "Her ghost wheels her barrow through streets broad and narrow, singing cockles and mussels, alive, alive, oh." And Hattie continued to hum and murmur under her breath the refrain, "Alive, alive, oh, alive, alive, oh." Suddenly Tom said, he blurted it out before he could help himself, "What's it like? I wonder, what's it like to be dead and a ghost?" Hattie stopped singing at once and looked at him slyly over her shoulder and laughed. Tom repeated the question, "What is it like to be a ghost?" "Like?" said Hattie. She turned fully to face him and laid a hand upon his knee and looked eagerly into his face. "Ah, tell me, Tom." For a moment Tom did not understand her. Then he jumped to his feet and shouted, "I'm not a ghost." "Don't be silly, Tom," Hattie said. "You forget that I saw you go right through the orchard door when it was shut." "That proves what I say," said Tom. "I'm not a ghost, but the orchard door is, and that was why I could go through it. The door's a ghost, and the garden's a ghost, and so are you too." "Indeed I'm not. You are." They were glaring at each other now. Hattie was trembling. "You're a silly little boy," she said, and Tom thought resentfully that she had seemed to be growing up a good deal too much recently. "And you make a silly little ghost. Why do you think you wear those clothes of yours? None of my cousins ever played in the garden in clothes like that. Such outdoor clothes can't belong to nowadays. I know such clothes." "They're my pyjamas," said Tom indignantly. "My best visiting pyjamas. I sleep in them, and this is my bedroom slipper." His second slipper had been left as usual to wedge the flat door upstairs. "And you go about so in the daytime, always in your night clothes," Hattie said scornfully. "And it's the fashion nowadays, is it, to wear only one slipper? Really, you are silly to give such excuses. You wear strange clothes that no one wears nowadays because you're a ghost. Why, I'm the only person in the garden who sees you. I can see a ghost." Hattie would never believe the real explanation of his clothes, and Tom chose what he thought was a shorter counter-argument. "Do you know I could put my hand through you, now, just as if you weren't there?" Hattie laughed. I could," shouted Tom. She pointed at him. "You're a ghost." In a passion, Tom hit her with a blow upon the outstretched wrist. There was a great force of will as well as muscle behind the blow, and his hand went right through, not quite as through thin air, for Tom felt something, and Hattie snatched back her wrist and nursed it in her other hand. She looked as if she might cry, but there could not have been any pain, for the sensation had not been strong enough. In In a wild defence of herself, Hattie still goaded him. Your hand didn't go through my wrist. My wrist went through your hand. You're a ghost. You're a cruel, ghosty hand. Do you hear me? Tom shouted. You're a ghost, and I've proved it. You're dead and gone and a ghost. There was quietness then, in which could be heard a cuckoo's stuttering cry from the wood beyond the garden, and then the sound of Hattie's beginning softly to weep. I'm not dead. Oh, please, Tom, I'm not dead. Now that the shouting had stopped, Tom was not sure of the truth, after all, but only sure that Hattie was crying as he had never seen her cry since she had been a very little girl, wearing mourning black and weeping her way along the sundial path, weeping for death so early. He put his arm round her. All right then, Hattie, you're not a ghost. I take it all back, all of it. Only don't cry. He calmed her, and she consented at last to dry her tears and go back to plaiting the branches, only sniffing occasionally. Tom did not reopen the subject that upset her so deeply, although he felt that he owed it to himself to say, some time later, as Mr. Howard drilling would now, he's finished cutting it. He said to himself some time later, mind you, I'm not a ghost either. This, by her silence, Hattie seemed to allow. The next chapter is chapter 14, and we'll see what will happen. Perhaps Mr. Howard will stop cutting wood. Perhaps Tom might find out something more about Mrs. Bartholomew and Hattie. To wait and see.